please give a very warm welcome to Helena Kennedy QC and Alan Rusbridger.
Is that it? I thought you were nearest the door. Yeah. Well, welcome all of you to this special event, a conversation with Alan Rusbridger. I especially brought this blue notebook. I have to explain to anyone who's never been in a court of law, the blue notebook is the barrister's notebook in which they prepare a cross-examination. He got very worried when he saw that I had this with me. It was intended to intimidate you, Alan. Alan, there is a strong sense amongst those who know you that you are rather going out with a bang.
But I am.
Yes, a bang. In that, I mean, you've just been getting sort of more Oscars than George Clooney. I mean, you've received the UK Press Awards for Newspaper of the Year, the Polk Award in America, the European Press Prize, a Swedish Journalism Award, the Walkley Award, the Pulitzer Prize, the highest accolade that America can give for journalism. You won an Emmy Award, and you got to be played in Assange, the movie by Peter Capaldi. I heard that, in fact, there were other contenders, but, you know, they decided to go low-key. And in fact, chose somebody who didn't swear very much at all. And I mean, the truth is, I think most of us would agree that you have turned the Guardian newspaper, which we've known and loved, but into a global voice, particularly for the young, because of the way in which you've embraced new media. So you seized the right moment, it seems to me. Would that be fair?
I see what you mean now, yes.
Well, it's best to go out on a high, you know.
No, the last Sunday I was doing this rather extraordinary thing. I was, because actually I was rather fed up with Peter Capaldi. I was hoping for slightly bigger billing.
You wanted Brad Pitt, yeah. But you know.
And then the Oliver Stone movie. There are two more movies coming down. One is the Clooney movie about phone hacking, and then there's the Oliver Stone movie about Snowden. And when I read the Oliver Stone movie, I realized I wasn't in it.
Damn!
Because he stops the action on the night when I was flying to New York, and they had to decide while I was mid-flight what they were going to do. And I thought, there's another film I'm barely in. So I said to Stone, do you think I could just play a tiny little cameo role in this film?
A sort of Hitchcock walk-on role.
That's that kind of thing. So I went to Munich last Sunday to be a film star for a day. So it's all a bit weird, but the last 5 years have been rather amazing in terms of just a stream of really important, powerful stories of the kind that newspapers should be doing. So that does feel good.
Yeah, but I mean, I know that the last 5 years have been it's been a roller coaster. But you were somewhat, you know, you were forged in the fire of stuff quite early on in your career as editor of The Guardian, because there were a whole set of big libel actions then. I mean, I'm thinking of when I knew you long before, but when you became the editor, there was the business of Hamilton, and brown envelopes. We all remember that, don't we? There was the business of Jonathan Aitken. I mean, there were some really big libel actions where, you know, which could have bankrupted the paper if it had gone the wrong way. And you have to have nerves of steel to do that. Where did your nerves of steel come from?
Oh, I don't know. There must be genetic. Genetic nerves of steel. No, I mean it was a baptism of fire, and people don't really fight big libel actions nowadays, but in those days there were these huge set pieces in which they would last for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and you're right, they could cost millions of pounds and ended in humiliation or bankruptcy for one party or the other. And when I took over, because Peter Preston had done a lot of work on the brown envelopes and Mohammed Al-Fayed and Neil Hamilton, Ian Greer. Then there was the Ian Aitken story the Jonathan Aitken story, which I published, which Aitken sued over, and that was another huge libel action. There was one with the Police Federation.
Well, I mean, the Police Federation was one that I particularly knew about because Stoke Newington Police Station was notorious for corruption and notorious because such bad things used to happen there, particularly if you were young and black. And one of the things was that if you wrote up a story, I mean, they had a policy, the Police Federation, which was to sue for libel. Especially if a story were written in a way that they didn't like and suggested that the police hadn't told the truth. And then, of course, almost invariably with these kind of cases, it was quite hard to get an acquittal, especially in the magistrates' courts, where two policemen said something had happened, and the magistrates automatically convicted. And so then they were on a high because they knew that they could sue if something had been questionable about the story. And so they sued for libel regularly and tended always to win. And
they
always won. And you took them on.
Well, yeah, we took them on because they had won 93 cases in a row. They were called garage accidents.
They were because the police officers always built a garage on the side of their houses with the money that they got for the libel actions. So,
and this the marvelous reporter
Duncan
Campbell, who did this story, who was our crime correspondent. And this was the sort of thing that you were facing at the time, that this story just said that 5 policemen had been moved from Stoke Newington. It didn't name them, and they did nothing for 3 years, because in those days you could sue at any time up to 3 years. So at midnight at the end of 3 years, they sue, and they all say, my mother I wasn't named, but my mother or my aunt recognized me from this story, and now we want £40,000 each. And we fought it. We got George Carman in.
George was your regular counsel for those cases.
Counsel, and he was
fierce and terrific,
rascally and wonderful, and specialised, as you know, in finding amazing pieces of evidence halfway through the trial.
Some of which was, they put a stop to that.
And there was a judge who was not very good, and we managed to complain about him.
He's not still alive. You won't be done for libel, will you? Is he still alive?
No, he's not. And he was sacked after that case. So it was a disgrace. But I think, the encouraging thing about the case was you put Duncan in the box, and Duncan was so clearly
honest,
a decent, honest reporter. I think the jury just looked at him and thought, we believe him. And it just stopped that routine suing of newspapers by the Police Federation.
I mean, I think it's important for people to get a sense of your 20 years, because you came in 1995, and what we're all celebrating in your sort of the life and times of Alan Rusbridger is that you took, in that 20 years, when I looked at it and sort of, did the lawyer's thing of trying to contextualize it, was that it seemed to me that you were the editor of the Guardian newspaper in a period of incredible both social and political change. And social, we can all think of the ways in which our society has shifted and changed in wonderful ways in relation to, the rights of gay people and in putting onto the agenda the business of minorities and I think human rights. And I think the Guardian's played a great role in doing that. But also the stuff about how our society shifted and changed since the end of the Cold War. And we've seen incredible shifts with the arrival of a real kind of embedding of neoliberal economics across the board and the impact of all of that, and the business of neoconservative policies on foreign policy and conflict and war and international relations. And so it was a really fabulous period, but also it could have been a very difficult, it was a difficult time, and you could, if you hadn't been the man that you are, the newspaper might not have developed in the way that it did, because we were seeing also, for newspapers, kind of retreat from print media, from the press. And you, before anybody, spotted the fact that if you didn't go with the tide, it was going to take you down. And so you actually were ahead of the game in going with, with digitalization, with getting online and all of that. Why were you so in touch with the zeitgeist in the way that other newspapers weren't?
Well, I went to America in 1993 and discovered they had this thing called the internet there, which we
hadn't arrived here yet,
we hadn't
really.
quite got here then. And I did a sort of 5-city tour, and I was so excited. I came back and wrote Peter Preston a memo and said, there's this thing called the internet, and it's going to change everything. And I just had this burning conviction that nothing would be the same. And I've always been keen on gadgets anyway, so this appealed to the sort of the inner nerd in me. And I think we saw early on that the internet didn't involve simply putting the newspaper online, that this was an entirely different medium. It was going to, you would have to do something very different with it. We got that right, and I think we got the second wave of the internet right, which was the sort of the whole social web, and that this was going to be, in a way, even more profound than the first wave of the web, because it completely altered the relationship with the reader and with sources and how stories would work. And I don't know, we were lucky enough to have some incredibly wise and brilliant people who could see over the horizon and could see what was happening.
I mean, you've now got 120 million unique browsers. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a very funny thing that The Guardian has always been a very small paper in Britain. I mean, it's always been a very influential paper in the world, but it's the 8th biggest paper in Britain, so it's sort of tiny.
Yet, in the world...
Well, in the world, it's just overtaken the New York Times. So if you discount the Daily Mail...
we do.
For the purpose of this exercise, then it's the biggest English language paper in the world. And that is an amazing thing for the Guardian.
I was on the board of the independent newspaper in the late 90s and into the sort of millennium. And it was very interesting because everybody watched what was happening at The Guardian and sort of couldn't quite understand why you were going to be able to make this work. And I saw another newspaper that didn't, had then trouble making catch up. And it really was interesting about being ahead of the game. And was that because of, well, I mean, obviously you led it, and then Georgina Henry came in and was involved with you in all of that. But is it because the newspaper was more youthful than many of the others?
No, I don't think. I think there was brilliant people like Emily Bell and Ian Katz, who started off Guardian Unlimited, Simon Waldman. There were just some very clever people who saw it. And I remember I used to play golf with Simon Kellner, who was editing The Independent.
Yeah.
And he used to just say, look, the internet's a complete waste of time.
Yeah, but that was the story.
When it makes some money, come back and tell me, and I'll take some interest in it. And The Independent sale during the week is now down to 35,000 copies a day. And they just didn't get in and create anything that was worthy of The Independent. And that's what terrified me. I thought that would be the most terrible legacy to have, to come to the end of your time at The Guardian and not readied it for the digital
Next
age.
generation. But the interesting thing was that conversation about, wasn't it in some way affected by the fact that the imperatives of a newspaper that's not owned by somebody or an entity in the way that the Scott Trust runs The Guardian means that you have different, if you like, impulses operating. So that, for example, the thing that puzzled people, and I'm sure it was happening at the Times and at the Telegraph at the same time, and certainly it was at the Independent, was, well, how can you make money out of this? How can you, if you're not selling newspapers but they're getting your stuff online, how does this work? and they couldn't see a way of making it profitable. And I think that, therefore, that in fact, although they were commercial entities, they were less risk-taking.
Yeah, no, I mean, can I talk about the Scott
Yes.
Trust for a couple of minutes? I mean, the Scott Trust is this extraordinary thing that underpins everything that we do. And there was this extraordinary essay that C.P. Scott, the great editor of The Guardian, who edited it for 57 years. So he started at the age of 25 and gave up when he was 82. So
You're leaving far too young.
I know.
God.
But he wrote this extraordinary essay in 1921 on the centenary of the essay, and it's the famous essay which has, comment is free, facts are sacred. But he also says, a newspaper is a business. Of course, it has to be sustainable. But if The Guardian had only been a business, I would not have been interested in doing this. And he was so believed in there was a sort of higher moral purpose of a newspaper. And not having shareholders, not having people who wanted set levels of profit or increased levels of profit has meant that The Guardian has been able to think flexibly and invest in the future in the way that BuzzFeed or Twitter or Amazon, none of those make a profit, but nobody thinks it's stupid that they're losing money because they see that as investment in the future. So if you've got something in which the main purpose when you come in the morning is not to make a profit, but to produce the best possible journalism that you can, it just does alter the way that you can think about what you're there for. And that doesn't relieve you of the necessity to make enough money to keep it going in perpetuity, but it just does alter the nature of the decisions you take.
That's the thing that came through to me looking back over this period and having had my own experience in newspapers, was that sense that somehow you were freed from something. But also it's part of the tradition of The Guardian. I mean, that it came out of a sort of dissenter, non-conformist tradition, Manchester, as distinct from the metropolis, that it came out of something rather different in the post-Peterloo massacre period. That history actually sort of does still live and breathe a bit in the interstices, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. I mean, for those of you who don't know the origins of The Guardian, the Peterloo massacre, which was an event in which the police rode into an unarmed crowd who were protesting peacefully and wanted the vote. And in the crowd was a man called John Edward Taylor who felt it was vital that the truth of this event was written up and published, because otherwise the state or the magistrates would publish their version. And he wrote a version, got it to London, and then he thought, I should start a newspaper.
Yeah.
Because this is really important. Some people think this was the birth of the reporter in English public life. And 2 years later, he did. A few years ago, a man died during the G20 protests in London, peaceful protests.
Tomlinson.
Ian Tomlinson, who was a news seller. And the official story was that he had had a heart attack, and the police had tried to rescue him, but they hadn't been able to. And we had a reporter who didn't believe that story; it didn't ring true. And he used social media to track down the witnesses to what had happened. It turned out he hadn't had a heart attack; he'd been attacked from behind by a policeman. And there was such a link between those two things that was the spirit that motivated the start of The Guardian. There 185 years later, there was The Guardian still doing the same.
Yeah. I mean, people will probably not realise your own backstory in that, you started off a graduate from Cambridge in a Cambridge newspaper, and then went from there to The Guardian. And so you've sort of how old were you when you went to The Guardian? It's somewhat been man and boy, really.
25.
Yeah, so you were 25. You had a stint, a very short interregnum, working in Washington for that short-lived London Evening News, was it? I can't remember.
I left I went to work for The Observer, which I didn't enjoy because I took over from Julian Barnes as TV critic, and I just hated sitting in a room watching television, which is a bad thing in a television critic. I should have seen that coming.
Yes, that might not work.
No.
Yes.
Then I went to work in Washington for Captain Maxwell.
Yes. Was that fun?
Well, it was very odd being interviewed by him because he didn't want me to work for him. Magnus Linklater, the editor, wanted me, and he just sat there shouting at me for half an hour and demanded to know if I was a communist, if I'd taken drugs. And then he wanted to interview my wife, and I just sort of sat there thinking, this is the maddest man I've ever met. But Magnus said, it'll be all right. And it was really interesting. I mean, it was, incredibly, it was during the height of Iran-Contra, and an amazing thing. And then, just as I'd unpacked my last suitcase, he closed the newspaper. It was worth doing.
It was worth doing, but it was short-lived. And then you came back, and that was when you came back enthused about the possibility of the internet having a bigger role in everybody's life, and foresaw stuff that most people hadn't imagined. And you were deputy editor pretty quick, soon after that. When did you become the deputy editor?
Well, I was deputy editor for a year, and so Peter suddenly asked me to edit, and we launched Guardian Weekend, we launched G2.
G2, yeah, launched a lot of new things that you were involved in. Yeah. And then you became the editor. Then, as I see it, you had to, really gird your loins for a lot of battles, and you had them in the law courts. I remember also some of them linking into chambers, into my own chambers, because there were some of those issues that we kind of got involved in, or certainly Jeff Robertson did too. I just want to remind people about let's, for example, take a little look at the business of Aitken, of Jonathan Aitken, because he really did want to take you on and to go to war with the Guardian, encouraged greatly by the Conservative Party at that time, many of his colleagues in his own party. And his whole kind of thing was he was going to use the sword of truth to lay low the Guardian newspaper for its great dishonesty. It was a kind of bold thing for him to try to do. But the story was, it was actually about something that is interesting now, because it was still about Saudi stuff contaminating British politics, because he was up to his eyeballs with the Saudis, wasn't he?
Yes, I told a young colleague this in the pub the other day. She'd never heard of the Sword of Truth. She'd never heard of Jonathan Aitken. And
you said that's why we have to keep telling these stories, And
I started to tell the story, and they just couldn't believe what had happened. So you're right. The Conservative Party thought this was payback time for Cash for Questions, and they really thought they were going to bring me down and bring the Guardian down.
You see, because Hamilton had just been before that, and people had been accepting money to ask questions in Parliament, on behalf of basically vested interests, and they were getting bungs for doing so, and that was all exposed in the paper. So there was a lot of people pissed off who wanted the Guardian brought to its knees, and particularly under its new, very young editor. And so Aitken was pretty rash in taking you on, but let's hear the story.
Well, the issue was who had paid. He'd been in the Ritz Hotel in Paris with a lot of, I think they probably were arms dealers, and the question is who he hadn't paid his bill, and he was a cabinet minister at the time, and this hadn't been declared, and Peter started writing about this, and we took it on. And the question was who had paid, and his story was that his wife, Lalicia, had paid, and she had been staying at the Hotel Bristol in Geneva. You still with me? And we got to court, and we still hadn't worked out. None of us could understand
complications of this story, that his wife was in the Bristol Hotel in Geneva, he was in the one in Paris, but somehow she'd managed to come to pay his bill.
Paid the bill. And in those days, under libel, actually today, if you fought libel action, the burden of proof is on the defendant. So you have to prove the truth of what you had written, even though he was the only person who knew the truth. So we were struggling a bit. And we got into court, and there was a judge called Mr. Justice Popplewell.
Popplewell, yes.
Popplewell. And I think he was an old Etonian, or if he wasn't an old Etonian, he was an old Wikimist. Anyway, Aitken got in the box, and you could just see this love affair between Popplewell.
A welding of
They loved each other.
Interest.
He was in the box for about 5 days, and there was a massive bromance going on between Aitken and we just knew we were going down. And Carmen, we had George Carmen again. And we had a wonderful solicitor, Geraldine Proudler, I don't know if she's here today, who just said, why don't we just have one more go at finding out what happened in the Hotel Bristol? And I thought that was the most hopeless thing that anyone had ever suggested. But nevertheless, we sent a reporter, Owen Bocott, who went to the Hotel Geneva on this completely useless errand. And when he got there, he found it had gone into receivership. The hotel had gone bust. And there was a security bloke on the door, and Owen said, well, could I go and search through your records? And he said, yeah, help yourself there in the basement. So Owen went down into the basement. Meanwhile, in the High Court, love affair between Popplewell and Aitken going on.
And the clock is ticking. There's a movie in this, and then...
There is one, and then so Owen's in the basement going through all these receipts. Meanwhile, we were doing this case with Granada TV. The insurers for Granada TV had been watching this love affair between Popplewell, and they said, we're now pulling the plugs on the insurance. You're going to lose massively. We won't pay any longer. We had a sort of crisis meeting in George Carmen's chambers, and I said, I was just stubborn. I just said, well, I think, Granada the TV can back out, but we're going to fight on because I just believe in my reporters. Then amazingly, Owen found the receipt for the thing, and he faxed it to Geraldine and said, I don't know what this means, but here it is. And Geraldine spotted that there was the receipt and be paid for with a different credit card, and one that hadn't been disclosed to us. So she put in a disclosure to find what else was on this credit card, and there were various airline tickets and train tickets. And as she looked through all these travels, it became apparent this was Lilicia's travels. Remember, she was supposed to be there, and she could have been
And she'd travelled to Paris to pay the bill and all that.
And the truth dawned that Aitken's story was impossible. It was just impossible. Back in court, love affair, and the Aitken's QCs came out and said it's Ladies' Day at Ascot tomorrow, and we're going to have Ladies' Day in court here in the High Court, because we're going to call Lilicia and we're going to call his daughters, and the case is just going to be wrapped up neatly with these lovely ladies who are going to come along and give evidence.
Fragrant
Yeah.
women.
And I listened to this, and I knew that we had the killer evidence that was actually going to finish off the case the next day.
George must have been
it was
in seventh heaven.
This was bigger than Gillian Tailforth and her sausage. Older readers may remember that. And at 4 o'clock, at the end of the play at 4 o'clock, George Carmen said, if it pleases you, my lord, could I just ask you to look at this piece of evidence? And Popplewell looked at it, and colour drained from his cheeks. He handed it down to Aitken, and at that, I was at the back of the court, and I just saw the back of Aitken's head, and I knew he knew that was...
It was over.
...the end of his life, in public life. It was just the most dramatic moment. And that night, we retired to our chambers, he retired to his chambers. Later that night, he got separated from his wife. About 11
she walked
o'clock
out on him and said she was not going to testify dishonestly on his side.
And it was just the most extraordinary moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of Perry Mason stuff. I wanted Owen Bocott to be running into court with a bit of paper and Aitken to have to fold in front of us.
And the sequel to that was that, Aitken then went to prison.
Yes, for perjury. Yeah.
And then about 3 years later, the Hay Festival, little town in Hay, and we all stay in bed and breakfast houses, and it's all very charming. And I was having a rest on my bed in the afternoon, and I heard this voice. I heard these people having tea in the afternoon in the garden outside. And it suddenly dawned on me that one of the voices was Jonathan Aitken.
Staying in your B&B?
And that he was staying in the next door bedroom in the same B&B. And there was no way out of it. I just had to go down into this garden and say, hello, Jonathan, it's a long time since we met.
Well, there you are. But as well, I mean, it is important for new generations to hear these stories, because some of them were so absolutely awful, and those battles, in some ways, must have, I think, prepared you, because you had to basically, I mean, you know, it was stick or twist, and you had to end up sticking in order to make sure that you took it to the end of the road. But the risk financially to the paper must always weigh heavily on your shoulders, especially when it's.
Yeah, because the Guardian is. I mean, we're in a very solid financial position now because we sold this wonderful magazine, Auto Trader. No, seriously, and managed to bank. I mean, we have about £1 billion, so there's a very solid financial legacy to hand on to the next editor. But it wasn't always the case, and some of these cases were touch and go, and would have cost a lot of money if we'd lost.
As well as taking on, taking on politicians, but the paper has had to take some brave stances in dealing with some major corporates. I mean, one of the cases that always outraged me was the business of Trafigura, and that was one of the ones also where you did, you know, do the brave thing. And I think that sometimes people don't remember that, but that was about dumping waste in African countries. I mean, it was really disgusting, and in fact involved some cabinet ministers. I mean, some people who were certainly people in the House of Lords who were involved in high-level politics. But wasn't there a super injunction? Wasn't that the time of the super injunctions?
Yeah, we got hold of an internal document that was, the thing hinged on the toxicity of what had been dumped and whether it could have been
Toxic
linked.
waste was being, and the effects on people long term.
And there was one internal document we got that was about the toxicity, and they went to court and got an injunction to prevent us from reporting it, and then got a super injunction to stop us from reporting on the injunction that they'd got. That was absolutely outrageous. And then didn't want it discussed in Parliament or anything else. And those situations are always actually quite nice as an editor, because you can be quite mischievous. You can start publishing stories on the front page that say, there's a story about a company we can't name. We can't tell you why we can't name it. We can't tell you whether there was any court action about it. In fact, there's nothing we can tell you about it, but you just put it on the front page.
And people can work things out.
And everybody gets terribly intrigued. And then there's usually some rogue MP who stands up and
asks the question in the House.
Asks the question in the House of Commons, and the name pops out, and then it all starts to leak out, and then people start tweeting it, and you just sit there innocently saying, nothing to do with me, Guardian. I can't tell you.
One of the things that your journalists say is how much they respect you because you've respected them. And it is an issue of trust, of trusting your journalists. And you actually said it at one point earlier on about trusting your journalists and then sticking with them. And I mean, there have been quite a number of those calls where you've had to do that, whether with David Lee, who has been one of your great investigative journalists, Nick Davis, and so on. Do you ever get a feeling in your waters that a story might not be well-founded?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're there, you carry the ultimate can, and you have to use your judgment and read into the background documents, you talk to the lawyers. But in the end, you have to form a judgment. And I mean, editors don't do the hard work. The reporters do the hard work. And if you're lucky enough to work with reporters like David Lee and Nick Davis, who are just wonderful, wonderful reporters. I mean, the work that Nick did on phone hacking, which took 7 years, David Lee worked on British aerospace for the best part of 20 years.
Yeah.
And they are they're the people who do the incredibly hard, brave. I mean, reporters go out and risk their lives for The Guardian on a daily basis. And so it's quite easy, really. I mean, as an editor, you're there to protect them and to get their words into print and on air. And the reporters are always the heroes of any newspaper.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
One of the, I mean, I want to talk about those stories, the hacking and the British aerospace, but I mean, the British aerospace was one that particularly stuck in my craw because I thought it was about, I mean, again, it was a decision which involved the Attorney General, or certainly it was how it appeared, the Attorney General kind of deciding not to prosecute, where all the evidence, certainly if you speak to American lawyers in the Justice Department in the United States, as I have done, many of them who were involved in that case say that the evidence was absolutely clear, for example, in the end over the Saudi prince and the payoff, and which was a big, I mean, it was a big corruption scandal. And they felt very aggrieved that the prosecution didn't go ahead here in Britain because they felt they had them banged to rights. And I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, presumably there are certain people who are even in the Blair government who mustn't talk to you when you see them socially.
Well, that was always true, yeah. No, well, it was a disgraceful ending that the government essentially overrode the SFO. And I think the police felt very frustrated about it because
the police were frustrated. The American Justice Department, who'd done a lot of work, the lawyers in the United States, there were a lot of people very pissed off. Did it come right from the top? Was it out of Downing Street?
I would imagine so. Yeah.
And then I remember the business on the Iraq War, on the legal opinion, because I was involved a little bit on that because into Philippe Sands' hands had come the long opinion that Peter Goldsmith had made in relation to the legality of the war. And Philippe came to me to talk about, because he was anxious about whether the propriety as a lawyer of making it public. And the answer to that is always there's security in numbers. And so we gathered together quite a number of leading lawyers to actually deliver it into the hands of first Jon Snow for Channel 4 News and then to all of you guys at The Guardian. But again, that was one of those scandalous things where it really was about having to speak truth to power. And you were always there, happy to, support getting that sort of stuff out. And that caution that sometimes is an excuse for cowardice has never been part of your package, has it?
No, I remember one of my journalistic heroes was a man called Dennis Foreman, who was editor of Granada TV, and we had lunch once. He was one wonderful man, very huge, imposing man with one leg. The other had been blown off in Italy, and I was in the middle of some enormous libel battle. He said, "Oh, you're struggling with such." He said, "What fun!" He said, "I love a decent libel battle." And I don't think I quite saw it that way at the time, but I did think of it because actually these things are, if it's right and if it's important, if it's in the public interest, then it's wonderful fun publishing this stuff because it causes such trouble and mayhem, and it's right to publish it. That's what journalism is there for.
But you, all of this was a kind of preparation for the whole big freedom of information stuff. I mean, around first of all, WikiLeaks, and then the Snowden revelations, and each in turn involved the classic thing where the government and the state maintains that national security is put at risk by this stuff, and where no other newspaper seemed to be prepared to take the stance that you took. And then you had to go abroad to find, security in numbers. And I just wanted to ask you about that. I mean, first of all, there was a downside to the WikiLeaks story of having to deal with Julian, and I can't go there because I've advised him on occasion myself. But then there was the business of Snowden, and that the whole story of that, and the government really coming down incredibly heavy on all of you, and the destruction of the computer and so on. Is there ever a moment where you feel, am I going to end up in jail?
Yeah. With both WikiLeaks and Snowden, especially Snowden, there was, it may still be, I mean,
there was a real risk,
the police are maybe still investigating us. So with Snowden in particular, quite a possibility of jail. But again,
what a lot of people are going to want to know, and it's certainly what I want to know, is where does that come from? Because Alan, you were born in Africa. Your father was an education officer in Zambia.
In Zambia.
And then returned to Britain. You went to very good posh schools. You ended up going to Cambridge and so on. You had the trajectory of somebody who, by and large, would be cautious about taking on the establishment. And yet there is something about the way that you feel about that. And it's not in the way that I feel about the establishment, which is about a kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but I kind of don't ever feel that I belong, or even if people think it looks like that. But you actually, it seems to me, are never intimidated by them because you just don't want to belong. You don't want any sense of belonging. You feel absolutely unattracted to all of that. Where does that come from?
I think that's true. Well, I think there's two things. One is about the institution. So the longer I've done this, I think the sort of institutional importance of newspapers can't be underestimated. So you can do a story like Snowden, they will come at you, or you can do a story like Murdoch, and they will come at you ferociously, and that's very uncomfortable, and it can be incredibly expensive, and you just have to have a brilliant team and an institution that is as strong as they are, and the Guardian is. It's as strong as anybody who's going to come for us, and we've taken on, the most powerful forces in the world, if you like. But the Guardian is always going to stand up for its journalism and will be a strong defender. And if as editor you're not prepared to be part of that, then you shouldn't be editor. So that's kind of sort of easy. That takes care of itself. And the second bit is about journalism. And again, I've just come to believe this more and more strongly about the importance of journalism as a completely independent entity, estate, whatever you want to call it, and its ability to hold power to account is so vital, so important. And so once you've got those two, if you believe that, then you don't want to belong to anything. You don't want to be part of anything. You don't want to owe anything to the establishment or anybody else, because your role is to stand apart from it and interrogate it. And once you've worked that out, then it's all fairly simple.
Nick Davis says that the thing about Alan is that he's got one piece of equipment that few other editors have: a spine. I want to ask you about the whole, an interesting thing has happened recently with The Guardian, where you're wanting to save, if you like, the long opinion piece. You've sort of opened up The Guardian to pieces sort of similar to the sort of thing that you might find in the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books. Longer, more reflective pieces that normally newspapers don't have time for. And I thought, I wondered if that had come out of the opportunity that you had seized occasionally to do that kind of writing in other places. And one of the most interesting articles that I'd seen that you'd written, Alan, was a piece that you wrote in the New York Review of Books a few years ago now. But it was about the problem that's presented to newspapers today of trying to unravel the Byzantine methods for tax avoidance by the big corporates. The ways in which, in fact, as newspapers are shrinking and as the money to be spent on good journalism is shrinking, you know, even with people like Nick Davis and David Lee and great and you know good investigative people, to get to the heart of the corruption that goes on in terms of not paying proper taxes, you know, and the scandals around banking and all of that stuff that we've just had as our recent history, newspapers were not equipped for that. And you wrote a piece which was about the libel litigation you got involved with Tesco, where Tesco, you had written a piece about Tesco having some sort of tax avoidance schemes to avoid corporation tax and being involved in Jersey and places like that, offshore. And they sued you. And then it became rather clear that actually you'd got the story wrong. The story wrong in as much as they weren't avoiding corporation tax, they were avoiding land duties on buildings that they were building. So they were fiddling, but it was the wrong fiddle, right? And your piece in the New York Review of Books was about the absolute complexity of this stuff, that getting to the heart of it was so hard, cost so much time and money from specialist investigators and so on, that actually getting to the heart of the matter was almost well-nigh impossible. I mean, what chance have we all got in terms of really calling to heel the abuses that are going on in our world?
Well, I felt particularly, I mean, it's awful. I mean, we did get it wrong. We got the wrong tax, and there's nothing worse than trying to defend a libel action when you're starting from a position of weakness. But nevertheless, they had been on the fiddle, as you say. And I think it was very personal. I think I'm sure Terry Leahy must have been directing the whole thing. In fact, they were suing people all over the world, it turned out. But anyway, it was very personal, and it cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. And every Friday night, another letter would come from Carter Ruck upping the gas.
Carter Ruck are almost always on the other side in any libel action.
And I didn't know anything about tax, and I discovered that nor does anybody else know anything about tax. Almost no corporate company directors understand tax, and in trying to understand this story and how we got it wrong and what they were really at, we had to go to the only people in the country who basically understand it are the people who construct the dodgy tax schemes in the first place. So we had to find them, we had to pay them hundreds of thousands of pounds to explain it. I mean, Tesco actually billed us about £300,000 to explain their own tax dodges to themselves. But, it was that complex. So, and in America, there's a famous case called New York Times versus Sullivan, which is essentially a kind of sort of public interest test. If you're doing stuff which is important and in the public interest, then even if you make a mistake, you ought to be protected against that kind of prosecution. And somehow British law doesn't recognize that. So we just had to fight it, and I wrote that long 5,000-word piece for the New York Review. And then I thought, well, I'm now really interested in tax. So I went to David Lee and I said, I think we should go for the biggest tax dodges in Britain, and we're going to run it over 10 days. And David, I think
blanched.
He loathed it because it was so complicated, all these double Dutch things, and he had to draw, and he had to get these amazing pieces of advice, because untangling what was going on. But nevertheless, he sat there, and after about 6 months, he'd worked it all out, and he came to me with a list of names.
If you want tax advice, David Lee's your man.
And I remember I thought I should just go to the director of advertising and tip him off that our 10 biggest advertisers were about to be worked over in the page of...
That's tricky.
Including Sir Martin Sorrell, who is Mr. Advertising, because
Yes.
WPP were up to no good. But, you know, the Guardian being the Guardian, the head of advertising said, OK, I wish you hadn't told me that, but and we did it over 10 days, and I hope all those tax dodgers know that Sir Terry Leahy was to blame for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but part of that whole thing was carried the frightening message, which is, of course, that the corporates are the masters of the universe and remain so even after the great collapse, and continue to go about their business as is. That's one of the things
and
that's
are
still
very well defended. I mean, everyone is much more defended than they were 20 years ago. So, you know, the growth of the PR industry and the impossibility of
penetrating
people directly, and you know, the ranks of PR people who will protect a company like Tesco, but not just Tesco. And it's increasingly hard to get through that. And, you know, we were touching on the economics of newspapers earlier. A lot of newspapers are in a powerless state. The economics of our industry are changing, and not many people are doing this kind of work now. They simply...
They can't afford to do it, and they can't afford to take on those interests because they know that the chances are that if they do, they'll be destroyed in the process.
Yeah.
And
especially, actually, local newspapers are. Local newspapers basically don't fight libel actions. They simply can't afford the cost even of writing a couple of solicitors' letters. And so the thing that the role that local newspapers used to play in fighting corruption at a local level is now going because they simply can't afford to do it.
But doesn't it make you depressed about the political system? I mean, that we have sort of operating at, you know, above the nation state, you know, global capital and the corporates that are operating there, and that, you know, avoiding taxation, unable to bring them to account. We all, you know, pay our taxes, do the business, but actually we're the little people, as Mrs. Helmsley, the great hotel owner who paid no tax, said of us all. You know, don't you have a sense of hopelessness about all of that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, they do actually. I mean, they still don't like it up on them. I mean, they don't
like being exposed as having.
They really don't like newspapers going after them. So, if you can afford to do it, you know, the power of the media, I think, is still not to be underestimated.
And will the new media be able to do it as well?
Well,
given that the old media is having to retreat from taking on that, you know,
I think it's
frontal.
a different kind. I mean, I think that sort of dogged David Lead, Nick Davis, James Ball style wading through documents and finding bad things going on. Maybe there's less of that going on, but I think the power of social media, you know, things like Twitter, once you get a mass consumer revolt against something, I think that is very powerful, and companies are terrified of that too.
Yeah, I mean, that is one way of bringing them to heel. As long as we all exercise the power of that, of coming together to expose the stuff that they're up to.
And ridicule. I mean, the power of, you know, when you see a company being ridiculed with some hashtag that just catches on, I think that's amazingly powerful.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in a minute, but you're not leaving us completely, in that you're going to go on to chair the Scott Trust as from next year, I think, and so you'll still be a Guardian man, yes?
I'm going to own the Guardian. It's almost literally. There is one. I mean, this extraordinary thing that happened in 1936. I think Martin Scott, descendant of Seabees, there he is there. This extraordinary thing that we should just just pay tribute to the Scott family, because they did this extraordinary thing of they could all have walked away with millions like the Bancroft family did with the Wall Street Journal, and they didn't. They just gave away this paper because they believed it was such a sort of important thing in public life, and they gave it away for £1, and that the Scott Trust today owns that one share in the Guardian. So I really, and Hugo Young and Liz Forgan were so important to me in watching my back. And when they came for us under Snowden, and they went to Liz and told Liz that she had to stop me from doing it, and Liz said, "I can't. I'm sorry. This is the Scott Trust. We literally can't tell him what to do." And so it's so important that somebody does that job. So that's the.
Why you all have to become members and protect this great institution. I mean, Alan, before I open it out, I mean, you're going to go off and become a head of house at Oxford and join the ranks of those of us who do this thing. And I'm going to rely upon you to make common cause with me to bring some justice to Oxford and some equity amongst the colleges, because there are rich colleges and poor colleges, and it's just like the outside world, and they don't share. And I'm going to rely upon you to come with me and to lead the way to the barricades on all of that. But piano, much more piano playing.
Much more piano playing, I hope.
Writing any more telly, because you've done that. You wrote with Ronan Bennett, a great two-parter. More of that. And
I would like to return. I had lunch with David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker in New York the other day, and he spends his holidays reporting.
So you're going to go back to reporting?
Because he just loves reporting, and I thought, yeah, I'd love reporting too, and I haven't done enough reporting. So
back to reporting, good. Now, who's out there who's got a question to ask of this man? Put him in the hot seat. Oh, there's some good hands here. There's 2 hands there, and there's somebody right there in the middle. Say who you are, and then pin this man down.
My name is Jaydeep. I'm a master's student at the University of Westminster studying journalism. You recently spoke about the power of social media. My question is related to that. The Guardian and a bunch of other publishers recently entered a collaboration with Facebook where your content will be hosted by Facebook. Does this mean that news publishers have accepted the dominance of social media over them in the online sphere, and is that good or bad for journalism?
Well, I think it's just a fact that a lot of people, and we had a choice about 5 years ago, and we went one direction, the Times of London went down another direction. So you can be a closed organization and insist that everybody comes to your site and pays for it. That's one route. Or you can say, well, actually, the reality is that information is distributed and shared in a completely different way, and people will choose where they want to read it, and so you might as well go where they are. So the deal with Facebook is we will publish more material onto their platform, and they will give us 100% of the advertising revenues associated with it. Now, that's either the most brilliant, inspired thing to be doing, or it's a pact with the devil. And we don't know at the moment, but at the moment, I think we have to be in the phase of experimenting with everything, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But I think it actually shows very few people, for reasons that may have become apparent during this talk, want to do what we do. It's a bit mad. It's not very profitable, to put it euphemistically. And it's tough. So nobody wants to get into that kind of, what people call the content business. And Facebook certainly don't want to, and Google don't want to. But they do want good content, to use the horrible word. And I think that's actually quite encouraging, that these enormous companies do actually want brilliant journalism, because that will help keep their business model afloat. So I think it's worth trying.
And there was someone just beside, yes, just there, in the row in front, gentleman there.
Tim Cowan, retired emeritus professor at UCL. I've been very moved and impressed by the Keep It in the Ground campaign, which hasn't been mentioned this evening. I'd love to know your feelings and your views about where you think it will go, particularly in relation to the campaign for divestment.
Alan, I mean, you've come to this. I mean, it was one of the things that you said, or I heard you saying at some point, that you regretted not having sort of got involved in the whole climate change thing earlier. But you certainly have been doing good stuff in the last year. What about the divestment campaign? Do you think it has it's going to have some purchase?
I think so, yes. I mean, I sat at Christmas and I just handed in my resignation, and I was thinking, I'm going to do this up to May. What regrets might I have once I don't have this, this incredible, once I'm not with this incredible institution? And it wasn't that we hadn't done climate change. We've got 5 people who are wonderful environmental correspondents. But I just thought, if the scientists are even half right on this, this is the biggest story of our lifetimes. But journalism, somehow, which is so good at describing what happened yesterday, is very bad at imagining what might happen in 20 years' time. And a story that should be on the front pages, in my view, every week, if not every day, is absent. And I think that's a failure of journalism. And we got together a group of colleagues in early January and thought, well, what can we do that would animate this and energize it? And we thought we should do a campaign, and we settled on a campaign around divestment. And it's had surprising success, not in the sense that the Wellcome Trust and Gates have immediately divested, but what I thought was going to be a sort of moral campaign, which it obviously is, saying that fossil fuels could be thought of as not unlike tobacco or South Africa, has actually got this very practical thing, which is that you're actually mad to be invested heavily in fossil fuels if you want to have long-term security, because these companies cannot be allowed to dig up the assets that they own or which are on their books if we're all to stay within 2 degrees. And humankind will come to that realization at some point, and that's why people like Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, not necessarily a leftish, vegetarian, greenish figure, is waving a big red flag saying, actually, this is an asset bubble. These are subprime assets that are about to go pop. So actually, we've got in just at the point where the financial community is waking up to the fact that this is bad stuff to be in, which is why you're from UCL. So many universities are now, the penny is dropping, and this divestment campaign is beginning to get traction.
It really is. It's suddenly bubbling in all the universities, and they're having to, and their student bodies are really beginning to sort of start.
Oxford has been weak.
Very weak, absolutely. Now, there was a gentleman somewhere up there, a bit further back. You got the microphone? Great.
Thank you. My name is Paul Eakins. I also work at University College London. I also work on issues of resources and the environment. And I was going to ask you to talk about the climate change campaign. And I just wondered whether you could speculate a bit as to what the news might be that might make other non-Guardian newspapers take about 1/10 of the interest that the Guardian is currently taking in this issue, because although you have a global reach, there are lots of other newspapers that aren't taking it so seriously.
Well, I think unfortunately it's become terribly political, hasn't it? So that green issues are seen as left issues, and so I think in the polemical world of the British media, the papers that are on the right tend to be more sceptical and fringe deniers, and to give much more space to people who are outright deniers. So I don't know whether the first movement will be in the British media, and of course there's this terrible thing going on in the BBC, with the BBC at the moment, that the BBC is sitting there under assault from the right-wing media, and the right-wing media are saying the BBC is to the left because we say the centre is here. And the poor old BBC, you know, they shout it so loudly, so viciously, and so prominently every day. And you've got The Guardian whispering over here, because The Guardian's a very mild-mannered paper, saying, we believe this over here. And so I think the BBC is struggling to know what to do about climate change, and that's really important. But we have actually, in the last few days, knitted together a consortium of papers around the world who have been inspired by The Guardian's campaign and want to get involved in the run-up to Paris. And the people who are negotiating in Paris, and I spoke to Ban Ki-moon last week and to Christiana Figueres, who's leading the Paris talks, they think what The Guardian is doing is essential in the run-up to Paris, because there had been complete silence in the rest of the media about this. You know, here are these crucial talks coming up in 7 months' time, and we expect our politicians to do really difficult things against a background where the media is silent, and that's asking a lot of politicians. So I'm very pleased that newspapers around the world are now going to come together and get the profile of this subject raised.
Any more hands? There's a hand down here. You can see it waving, drowning down here.
Hello.
I'm fine.
My name is Hak Yeung. I'm a writer from Hong Kong, and I'm interested in knowing that whether you consider the Snowden story a yesterday story or a story of the future. And now you're leaving The Guardian, and will The Guardian change its attitude in reporting or treating the story? Thank you.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the more you think about what Snowden unveiled, these are some of the biggest issues that we're going to have to face up to in the 21st century. People thought about it as a conflict of, of privacy versus security, or privacy versus free speech, but he raised so many issues about the future of the internet, about oversight, about governance, about the behavior of the telecom companies, about encryption, about international relations, about law, about the media, and they're all there. And in the last week alone, you've had the US Court of Appeal saying that actually the bulk data collection program that we wrote about was illegal. And Congress, by a massive majority, not a narrow majority, a massive majority, 300-odd votes to 80-odd votes, said that they weren't going to continue with the program of bulk collection. So this thing that Snowden raised has led to a massive debate. It's led to Congress and courts basically agreeing with him. And this issue is not going to go away. And so I think it's absolutely an issue of the future, and whether people have quite grasped in this country the enormity of what he revealed, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, it's amazed me that, I mean, certainly mainstream America understood it. I mean, partly because, of course, they attach so much more importance to the liberty of the citizen and so on. But it really didn't have the resonance here. It was in quite the same way. I mean, you could meet people in, folk who were quite Republican in the United States, but who were outraged at the idea. And so it is very interesting how
the person who moved this motion saying, well, I don't want to continue with this was Congressman Sensenbrenner, who's quite a right-wing Republican.
Quite right-wing, yeah.
And he just said, when I proposed the Patriot Act, I never imagined it was going to be used in this way.
I understand that there's a microphone roving up there, and there might be some hands up there. Yes, good, sir.
My name's Hank Roberts. I'm a teacher. Well, you should see Citizen 4 if you want to know the significance of what Snowden did, but also of what The Guardian did. It's absolutely magnificent. It's absolutely magnificent. It's world-changing, as you say. My question is regarding publishing and books. I have noticed that in the bookshops now, there are a lot more criticisms of government of every sort and every aspect of it. Also, films now are starting to, increasing number of films that are coming out that are educational and critical of what's going on in our society. Has the Guardian got any plans already to go directly? I know it supports books, but directly more into publishing and directly more into taking films forward.
Have people seen Citizen 4?
Yeah.
I mean, talking about reporters and the importance of reporters, is Ewan McCaskill
Ewan
here?
McCaskill, it was wonderful.
Just
Is Ewan around?
wonderful moment where...
Yes, he's there at the back, being modest.
Stand up, Ewan. Where's Ewan?
Take a
Come on,
bow.
stand up. Wonderful moment there in this tiny little claustrophobic hotel room in Hong Kong, and Snowden is gassing away about this and that and the iniquity of this, and Ewan sitting there with a reporter's notebook, and he just interrupts and said, I won't attempt Ewan's Scottish accent, he said, sorry, I don't know who you are. He says, oh yeah, I should have told you, I'm Edward Snowden. That's S-N-O-W-D-E-N.
Good reporting.
No, I mean, one of the reasons the present period is so expensive is in addition to doing all the stuff that we used to do, the newspaper, we have to do all the stuff that's now on multiple devices, data interactors. We have to get into video, the podcasting that we're doing, the podcasts around climate change. I hope people might listen to those, which is the kind of backstory to the stuff that we're doing online and in the paper. We are doing books. We've got a publishing division, and we've got a documentary division, and in a sense, a lot of these are just experiments. But the ways in which people consume information is just changing. But particularly, it is to some extent a generational thing.
I mean, arising from that, I mean, is journalism changing?
Hugely. Hugely.
Yes, but I mean, that thing that you described of being the thing that got you up in the morning and that you still might want to go back to being the reporter, the thing of wanting to get the story, of wanting to get the facts right, of feeling driven to make sure that it's accurate and so on, is that still out there? I mean, for me, I see, great young lawyers coming through, and I just feel the absence of opportunities for them to, be paid to do the good stuff that they want to do. There's plenty of good young people around. What's happening to the future of journalism?
Well, I mean, the basics of, I repeat what I said about reporting. To reporters like me are like bees. When bees go, we've had it. When reporters go, we've had it. They're that important. So that the basics of reporting are incredibly important, and they will never go away. But I remember Emily Bell, who's now teaching at Columbia University, she said to me she used to come to my office and say these extraordinary things. She'd say, I think Twitter's going to be a really important news media. And
you see,
this
really?
was at the time when, it was just people talking about the fact they were late for work. And of course that was completely right. And then she said, I think the story may disappear. And you'd say, yeah, Emily. And then 2 years later, what I think she meant was, we started life in reporting where you would write your story, put your coat on, go off to the pub, and tomorrow you'd come in and write another story. And writing the story was the end of the process. And now the smartest reporters use Twitter and other social media to announce they're writing a story and to get your input, because there's this new media mantra, our readers know more than we do, is often true. We've heard two eminent professors in the audience today who certainly know more than I do about climate change. So you can harness that knowledge before you publish, and then the moment you press the button and publish is in a sense the start of the story. Because people then start responding and say, well, actually, I could add more to that, or you've got that bit wrong, or I'd like to flesh that bit out. And how you deal with that, if you're sitting over there with your paywall and you're not really interested in a response, that is the end of the story. With The Guardian, you think this is intensely interesting because now we're learning more about this story. This story is getting richer all the time. And how you deal with that response. So you then start doing the live blog instead of the story, and you have wonderful reporters like Andrew Sparrow who sit there I mean, if you just want to know anything about Parliament, just read Andrew Sparrow's blog during the day. It's a miraculous account of Parliament each day because he's pulling in multiple sources. That's understanding how information is working today. So that there are things like that which are completely different from 20 years ago.
And below the line, you can get all this stuff. I mean, I remember learning it from, your great friend and colleague, Georgie. Yeah, George used to talk about that and had a community out there who kind of felt that she was their editor too.
Georgina Henry was she started Comment is Free, the great C.P. Scott thing. And she didn't want to live in a world in which there were 8 middle-aged white blokes who were the commentators who sat on a platform speaking down at the audience. She thought how liberating to be able to open up this space to multiple views and to have all this response. And, of course, we know that comment columns are difficult and argumentative and you get mad people in there and trolls and all that. But I now don't like reading articles unless there are comments under, because that's almost, that's the first thing you want to read after a thing as well. What are people saying about this? What's the response? And that's why this idea of membership, that you can all become members of The Guardian, is more than a piece of marketing. It's a genuine, there is no owner of The Guardian. The only relationship the Guardian editor has is with his or her, it's going to be a her next, her own staff, and with the readers. And so there's a meaningful thing about how we can create something that's never been known before in terms of a newspaper.
I'm getting towards the end of my time, but there's a hand right there in the middle, and there's a hand down here at the front, this woman here, second row, but a hand also up there in the middle.
Hi, Tricia Jones from ID magazine. You made a joke saying that you were young to be kind of leaving. Did you always plan to, did you plan this sort of a long time in advance? Did you know that you would be, at a certain time, you'd be like, yes, my time's up? Because it seems to, I'm sure a lot of us, that it's far too soon.
It's quite a tiring job. And it's kind of unrelenting. You get on the hamster wheel and you don't now get off it. It was really the Scott Trust. It was when Liz had to step down, and I thought the chair of the Scott Trust has always come from within The Guardian since 1936, and I thought it has to be a journalist, and that seems to me a very important thing to do. And we had we'd just won the Pulitzer Prize, and we'd done this extraordinary, and there were brilliant candidates to be editor. So it really all the planets aligned, and it seemed like a good moment.
And I said that there was a hand up there in the middle. Has somebody got the microphone? Please.
Is it working? Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Georgina, a failed barrister, as it is. But Alan, I'm very interested to hear what your thoughts are about the role of the media in the lead up to the referendum on the EU, and does The Guardian have any plans for the lead up in educating the public? Yeah,
referenda are areas where the media can play a big role in affecting opinion, or could do. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the Guardian obviously will be pro-Europe and pro-staying in. I mean, in a way, I'm quite glad to be out of this one, because I think it's going to be incredibly depressing. I mean, you saw how the right-wing media behaved in the run-up to the election. And you can just see what they're going to do over the Human Rights Act. You can see what they're going to do over the BBC. They've just got these bees in their bonnet. So in a way, it'll be quite a relief to be out of that. I mean, I think there's a problem, which you've seen this morning, is that I think British business will come out very strongly and point to the mortal risks of pulling out of Europe. So it's not going to be quite as simple as the battle lines that were drawn in the election we've just had. I'm not going to miss the opportunity to say this, but I actually think that on the referendum on Europe,
in the end, you know, Cameron and Osborne and them all will actually be on the side of big business, and the general thing will be this would be not a good thing to do. And I don't think that we will leave the European Union, but I think that the problem will be that they're going to have to give something to the right, and what they'll give them is the Human Rights Act, and they'll give them the business of our belonging to the European Court of Human Rights and that whole tapestry that binds us into something much bigger than here, which is about our connection and protection of human rights in the world at large, actually. This is the oldest human rights court in the world, actually, and it's so important that we're part of it and that we don't start pulling out because of the message it gives to other places. And so that will be the red meat that will be thrown away by the right, and I hope that you will all, to a man and woman, come out shouting to prevent that happening. But that's my fear.
And there's one nuance, there's an additional bit of nuance, which is either the strength or the weakness of The Guardian. But I say The Guardian will come out for Europe, and you know, in leader terms we will, and we will certainly report more fairly than I think anyone else will, the pro side of Europe. But of course The Guardian does speak with many voices, and we had a discussion this morning about this in the morning conference. We begin with a conference that anybody in the staff can come to. And you've got some quite Eurosceptical people in The Guardian too. You know, people like Larry Elliott were very anti-Euro at a time when there were people who were very pro-Euro. And that's one of the sort of challenges of editing, or not challenges, because if you're a proper Guardian editor, you just say, well, isn't that interesting? We've got all these different voices, and my job is to let them surface. It's not like some newspapers we could mention but won't, where you know the editor sits and says, this is what this paper believes, and the front page will say it, and the leader column will say it, and the reporting will say it, and the columnist will say it, and everyone will say the same thing. That's not, I think, what The Guardian should be. And so, I mean, the weakness is that you don't have quite that sort of thunderous menace that some papers have. But the strength of I don't think The Guardian readers want that. They want to be exposed to many views intelligently put.
Alan, I'm going to have to draw this to a close, which is a shame because we could go on asking you questions for a long time. But are you going to write a memoir about this piece of your life, about editing The Guardian? Guarding The Guardian?
Well, there's something rattling around in my head, which is the things we've been talking about tonight. So the passionate importance of journalism, and there's so much bad journalism around, but good journalism is so necessary. And so there's something there which I want to get out of my head. I can't quite, and I don't know if it's a book or if it's a film. Anybody wants to help me get this out of my head as a filmmaker or a publisher, or so it wouldn't quite be. I think a straight autobiography wouldn't be interesting, but there's something that would weave through the kinds of things that we've been talking about tonight, and which I do want to put down, because I think it's important to restate what journalism is, why it matters, and why the thing that I said earlier, the institutional weight and power. It's really important that, to my mind, that newspapers survive in a strong way, because they're needed as much, if not more, than ever.
Well, I just want us all to finish this by saying that the reason that I think that we're all here is because we think that you've been the most incredible editor of modern times, and that actually your courage and your integrity have shone through in the paper. And, you know, we really are here because we think that you've been the best of the best. Thank you. Come on. Well done.
we need a consumer boycott. And I also think that we need our government to stop subsidising the fossil fuel industry, which I say is a sum of £30 billion a year, according more or less to an IMF report, I think, that came out last week. I read about it in The Guardian, so it must be true.